Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rupert Reid. I'm the Director of Research and Strategy at Policy Exchange. Policy Exchange has had a long pedigree of work in crime and justice, from police and crime commissioners through to other bits of police service reform. We are looking in London at a 2-year now trend in knife crime spiking up in the wrong direction. We're over 100 deaths of mostly young people this year alone, which is more than, well, it's about 2 a week. And at the moment doesn't look like it's getting better. The Mayor has recently announced he's going to adopt something called the Violence Reduction Unit, which was very successful in Glasgow, and there are questions around whether that will be successful and if it's appropriate. Policy Exchange is particularly interested in issues affecting London. So we have a new unit called Livable London, which looks at all matters London. We aim to provide ideas for any party and none on issues like housing, crime, homelessness, rough sleeping. And so we're very excited to be able to put on this panel, which, despite the former Mayor of London speaking not too far away, you seem to have managed to bring yourselves here instead, which is very gratifying. And I'd say probably far more important. On my left is Duwayne Brooks, who some of you may know was with Stephen Lawrence when he was killed. Duwayne's been a champion and campaigner on the knife crime, youth crime, and I look forward to hearing from him. On my right is Kate Proctor, a journalist, political correspondent at the Evening Standard. And on the far right is Chishty, former commander at the Metropolitan Police, was tasked with clearing up after the London riots. And I think you said you lived on Tottenham High Street, was it, for 7 months or so?
Well, about 12 months.
So that's our panel. Paul Scully should be joining us a bit later on, he's an MP in South London. And without any further ado, get to the interesting bit, which is, Duwayne, you're going to kick us off.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's be as vibrant as those who's listening to Boris next door. Good one. My name is Duwayne Brooks, as the Chair said, and for those who don't know again, you will know my name from the murderous attack of Stephen Lawrence 25 years ago, which I do try to move on from. But wherever I go, everyone plasters me with Stephen Lawrence, which is the only way I suppose that most people will remember me anyway. So even though I have tried to move along, that will be there for life. I am here to talk about violent crime and the effects of violent crime in Lewisham, but also the failure in leadership from City Hall and from the Met. For me, the biggest issue around violent crime, if we just put to one side the trauma and the pain and the hurt from losing somebody or being a victim of knife crime, we just put that to one side for a minute. Where is our leadership? Where is our leadership from the Met, and where is our leadership from City Hall? I can't see it anywhere. I remember when Cressida Dick, the commissioner, was appointed. In one of her first press statements, she said that knife crime will be her #1 issue. She will be dealing with knife crime. All resources will be put to knife crime. The evidence is that's not what's happening. A year and a half ago, we had Sadiq's knife crime strategy. This is how we're going to tackle the scourge of knife crime across London, and we will see results. I think it was last week, he buried his knife crime strategy, not by telling us that he has, but by changing it to this public health narrative. All of a sudden, we've forgotten about the knife crime strategy, and it's now public health. Why? Why? Because he is failing. And we must not forget, even though he is the mayor of London, he's also the PCC, Police and Crime Commissioner. So he sets the strategic direction of the Met. Who knows what that is? I don't. Well, someone does. But I don't know what that strategic direction is. Because on the ground, the Met are still stopping, 60% of their stops and searches are for drugs. 99% cannabis. In all my years, and that's been quite a few, as a monitor and stop and search, City of London Police and the Met, and across the UK, mainly in the Met, I have never seen a search record for cocaine. Never. Cannabis, cannabis, cannabis. I've never seen one for cocaine. 15% of all searches are for weapons. Yet we know a huge number of young people are carrying weapons on a daily basis. So where's the strategic direction? Why are we not focusing on those who are carrying weapons rather than those who are smoking a quick joint? I remember when Sadiq launched his crime plan, and he asked every borough to put forward what their issues were, what their main issues were where they were locally. Not one single borough named cannabis or drugs as their issue, but we're wasting thousands of hours a year searching for cannabis. So who's to blame? If we put aside what we said in the beginning, who's to blame for the lack of leadership? Sadiq. Who's to blame for the lack of strategic direction for the Met? Sadiq. Who's to blame for police officers not knowing what to do on the streets? Cressida. There's one thing about Hogan Howe that made him different, and that was many people didn't like him, as they do Cressida. They didn't like him, but every officer knew what their daily role was when they were on duty, and that's the difference in leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Duwayne. Now going to ask Kate Proctor of the Evening Standard.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. So I've only worked for the Evening Standard for 2 years. Before that, I was working in the north of England, so I covered knife crime occasionally, sometimes in court cases, but obviously moving to London, working for the Standard, I've seen a completely different scale of the problem. As a reporter, you're often, people say that you get immune to things, and I can honestly say you never, ever feel anything but complete sadness when you come into work in the morning and you hear that someone else, some other young person has lost their life. The pictures are extremely graphic, and they cover our newspapers. We often put it on the front page, and it just doesn't really feel like anything's changed in this last year. You'll all know about this earlier on in the year, the homicide rate being higher than New York for a period of time, which was an extremely shocking fact. And this year so far, it's 100 young people have lost their lives because of serious violence. I live in Islington, which is one of those areas in London which is extremely middle class, and then at the same time has a huge gang problem. Just some of the things that have happened whilst I've lived there. A young man was walking along Upper Street, which again is one of the wealthiest streets in London, and he was walking past an ice cream shop. Someone got out of a van and stabbed him in broad daylight. And this was outside a shop full of little children. They all saw this happen, and then the person got back in the van and was driven away. That guy was called Marcel Campbell, and I just think it's really important to remember the names and the people that we're actually talking about here, the victims of these horrific crimes. Just before Christmas, a father of two was stabbed about 20 metres from my house. He was stabbed and killed. He'd been chased from a local petrol station to outside Islington Town Hall, where he died. So it just doesn't get, you can't really, as a reporter, ever sort of deal with it. It's still completely shocking every time it happens. And the fact that you live somewhere where these things happen as well means that it really has a big impact on you. I think what's been clear is that enforcement alone hasn't been working in London. And I think Sadiq Khan is now having a really big conversation, and perhaps there's a bit of acknowledgement there that, you know, things are at an absolute crisis point, and whatever strategy he has been employing needs to see some quite radical change. So the public health idea has been discussed quite a bit by Sadiq Khan, and also Sajid Javid has said that it's something that he would like to look at as well. In essence, it's a public health approach to violent crime is taking it beyond enforcement, and it's making sure that there's early intervention, that youth services are well funded, and that various different agencies are all able to engage, communicate better, and this involves a police force as well. So I think the idea is to try and work in a more holistic way. This public health model worked in Scotland, and it did have significant results. It was effective because it initially isolated leading gang members, particularly in Glasgow. There was also a huge investment in youth services, and something that I think was really powerful was that sentences were ramped up for those carrying knives. And I'd be very interested to know if that's something that could be replicated in England, because it seemed to be in Scotland. It was a particularly powerful deterrent. There's something that I've watched recently which I thought was quite powerful. It's a documentary by Vice, and I think it's called On a Knife Edge, and it's a really good bit of journalism. And one of the young men who's a gang member who's interviewed in that, he's asked, why do you carry a knife? And he just said, well, violence feels natural to me. And for me, that was a really sort of shocking thing for him to say, that, you know, if violence is natural to somebody, if violence is something that is part of your everyday life, to live in that state must be absolutely terrifying and hardening, and also quite dehumanizing as well. So I think if this public health approach is to look at anything, it's to try and understand that people feel that their whole lives are surrounded by violence, and it's something that they very much sound like they want to be removed from and taken out of. And just a last point from me, and it's something again that the Secretary of State has touched on today. It's I think what's really important is there needs to be a growing awareness of middle-class drug use, and particularly the use of cocaine, and the idea that, you know, that somehow you're not complicit in the cycle. So you might spend, you know, I'm just thinking you might spend a lot of time trying to live a very sort of ethical lifestyle, and make sure you do recycling, and make sure that you sort of wear the right cotton with your clothes. And then at the weekend, or you go to a party or a festival, and you know, cocaine is ordered in, and people are taking drugs in a recreational way. And I think until there's a greater understanding amongst middle-class drug users that they are complicit in a cycle, they need to think about who brought it to them, how it got there, and who was perhaps harmed in the process. And I think there's not going to be much of a change. And I think you've seen over the years things like powerful public messaging and powerful ways that the government have been able to run campaigns to change behaviour. And I'd be very interested to know any thoughts from the panel on whether something like that, an advertising campaign, might be of use. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Mac.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. I was going to start off by using the phrase "take back control," but it looks like Boris got there before me. I've been asked to comment on the description about London, that blood is all over the floors. I don't think that's either fair or either right to describe it as that, but we also have to recognise there's lots of people across the whole of London who are extremely worried about crime at the moment. There's a lot of nervousness, and there seems to be this edgy feeling where people aren't just settled. And I get that from lots of community members, from the whole diverse range of communities who still speak to me, who are always asking me whether or not London is safe. I also get it from young people who are scared about their journeys to and from school, and it's a real point of concern that we should have. And I also get from international people who want to visit London before they come to London. They're asking, is it really safe? Are we going to get robbed? Are we going to get moped crime? Are we going to get acid? Are we going to get attacked? Are we going to get knifed? So a lot of these things aren't boding well for London. Now, I think people feeling that way are entitled to feel that way, because if you compare the crime figures from 16-17 to 17-18, there has been a marked increase. And there's no point trying to disguise that. It is what it is. And we need to understand that to be able to deal with it. And I'll just read a few of those out so we're all on the same page. So total crime went up in between those periods by 6.4%. Murder rate went up by 51.49%, and at the moment it stands at 108 murders, I believe. The point you're talking about when it exceeded New York was earlier this year for 1 month only. Grievous bodily harm, which is the most serious end of violence, is up by 6%. Knife crime up by 21%. Knife crime with injury up by 5%. Knife crime with personal robbery 11%. And personal robbery by 36%. These are actual recorded police figures. Now, this is why communities are feeling so concerned about that, and this is why there has to be a level of intervention that's really, really effective. I'm also going to try and just provide an insight as to why we think we've got to the state we've got to, and why there seems to be an inability to deal with it. I've got no doubt whatsoever about the commitment of either Cressida Dick, the workforce. In fact, there's officers in the room today who will tell you that police officers work tirelessly day in, day out, and they believe in public service, they believe in protecting victims, they get up to do that. But there's two things that have happened, and I don't think that we've realised what's taken place. Since the drive of austerity since 2008, there's been this desire to cut down on public service spending. And that's been fine whilst getting rid of waste, because nobody likes waste, it's not good. Making systems more leaner, more efficient, and that's all very good. And whilst we've been doing that, also what's been occurring is actually the policing mission has expanded. We had a set of crimes which we used to describe as traditional crimes, the crimes that you'll be familiar with, robberies and burglaries and street crime. But in addition to that, there's been a whole set of new crimes that the police are expected to deal with. Cyber, online exploitation, fraud, radicalisation, countering violent extremism, countering terrorism. All of these have emerged. And what's happened here is actually you've had a diminishing workforce, which has continued to diminish. You've had an expanding array of things to deal with. And there's been an expectation that you deal with everything as a priority. Well, if everything's a priority, then nothing gets prioritised. And that's where we are. So moving forward, we need to have a really honest discussion. If we want to maintain total protection, which I think the public deserve, and it's something that we would want to do, then there's got to be a discussion about the model of policing, whether or not that's the 43 force model that we presently have, or whether or not there's a further injection of investment, which is probably needed, or we have an honest discussion with our public and prioritise what can and cannot be done. And that's a discussion that the Police and Crime Commissioners should and need to be happening. Going forward as an immediate solutions, one thing that's been taken away through the cuts is the presence and the visibility of local officers in neighbourhoods. Let's not underestimate the value and the significance of influence a uniformed officer has, who's friendly, who's familiar, who's available, who's accessible on your streets, in your homes and in your houses. It's reassuring to the public in those neighbourhoods, but also it's a massive deterrent. It always has been. But when that's been retracted and there's gaps, what you find emerges is a gap in confidence, a decay in trust, and before you know it, you've got a big difference, a chasm between communities and the police, which rails against the principles of policing, where the police are the public and the public are the police, as you well know. I think the other thing that we need to do quite urgently is, if we can't get resources in, if the long-term plans aren't going to have immediate effects, such as the public health strategy, which we seem to be going along the lines of, then we need some legislative support. We need a change in law that helps us deal with some of these criminal groups. Now, criminal groups always operate as networks. They get together in packs, they hunt in packs, and they harm in packs. That's how they do it. They need three things, normally: the opportunity to do so, capability, and motivation. Now, if we were to get into that network, and if we were to take away one of those limbs, it totally disenables crime groups to operate. Now, whilst it may sound contentious, something that I would certainly put on the table, and it'd be good to discuss, similar to antisocial behaviour orders, similar to harassment orders, similar to forced marriage orders, is to have an order, a bit like an injunction, in place, pre-arrest, pre-charge, based on intelligence, against an independent body, which then puts conditions on people so they can't associate, non-association clauses, their ability limiting them from going into different areas, from owning a mobile phone, from going on vehicles, whether it's a bike or a car, just restricting them to public transport. And before you know it, you've dismantled the network. And what that does do then is it disables their ability to carry on harming with knives and guns and robberies and acid on the streets of London and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Just before we go to some questions from the audience, I was just going to press a little bit more on that. Something, Duwayne, that Matt mentioned was the reasons behind why it's gone up recently. So this isn't a new problem. We've seen gang violence, youth violence in the past. Strategies have been deployed, and we enjoy, and it's gone down. We enjoy record employment at the moment. Wages are steady, or if not rising. Why, in your opinion, do you think we've seen this recent spike? Is the gangs getting worse? Is it social factors?
There are many factors that we can explore today, but one of those factors is being a repeat victim. And what happens is you're a victim of crime, you report it to the police, nothing happens. You become a victim again, you become a victim again. So the next time, you don't want to be that victim. So you then become that perpetrator. And that's the cycle we're seeing. So this increase of crime, you'll find that a lot of these young people who are carrying weapons, they've all been repeat victims of crime. And they've lost trust and confidence in the police, so they don't report their issues to the police. The next interaction they then have with the police is either they're a victim of serious violence or they're the perpetrators. And that's what we're seeing. If we want to break that cycle, firstly, we need to build engagement. We cannot solve this issue without having friends in the community. The police can't solve crimes without the public. It's obvious. We know that. So it doesn't matter if you've got 50,000 police officers on the streets. Crime will always take place. It's how we deal with it afterwards. If we have increased engagement, trust and confidence locally, then those who everybody knows, because you go to a state or any part of London, any borough, and someone's been stabbed or someone's been robbed, everyone knows who's done it. But no one's prepared to speak to the police. So if we can change that, if we can build trust and confidence amongst the public that the police will do something about an individual, people will come and speak to you. I see it all the time where people come to me and say, Duwayne, I know who's done that stabbing, or I know who's done that robbery, but I can't give my name to the police because the police is going to tell somebody else who's going to tell somebody else, and it's going to come back to me. I can't talk about it. So when I hear, for me, excuses of cuts, well, everybody's suffering cuts. The Met is an organisation that needs to change, like all the other organisations have had to change. So let's get on change, let's work in a different way, and let's try and engage better with the public that we serve. That's just my view.
Either of you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind two points if I may. Firstly, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think engagement with the public, with the communities, is essential for trust and confidence. And engagement doesn't mean just turning up to an event or giving out an award or just a fleeting visit. It means having a relationship, a trusting relationship, where the community asks you to do something, you do it, you report back you've done it, and if you can't, you justify why you can't. That's the model that's been tested and works and does build confidence. And secondly, I think we've got to be honest with ourselves where, you know, remodelling and reshaping, I think a lot of that's occurred. But please bear in mind what I've tried to describe. I think the policing mission has stretched. I think you do need capacity to be able to keep up with the new crime types as well as the old crime types. So I think there is a degree of honesty where perhaps a further look needs to be taken to see whether or not we need, or the police need more resources, especially at the neighbourhood level.
All right, we'll open up to some questions now. We've got a little while, so I'll take them in batches of 3. The rules are no question too outrageous, but you just have to state your name and your organisation. So I'll take the first 3. Gentleman here.
Hi, name is Nick Allaby. I'm a councillor in Chingford Green. Is this working? Oh, it is. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, name's Nick Allaby, councillor in Chingford Green. I think Duwayne Brooks was quite right in summary of what he said, but I've got to just elaborate on that. The gangs are drug gangs, and they're being controlled, and a lot of the crime is coming through these drug gangs, and they're not being tackled. And I think that's where our biggest problem is coming from. Policing, yes, it's changing, but it's not just resources, it's clever policing that we need to do. So I think just to throw resources at it, and everybody keeps talking about money, 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 it's not. It's about doing things more efficiently and more effectively. Most of the time, you're not getting the intelligence because you're not putting the people into the gangs to get the intelligence from. So I think that needs to be looked at. But Wayne was quite right. Kids are coming to the police, telling you, we've got a problem, they're not looking into it, there's no engagement, and then that's escalating, and that's where our problems are. Our borough is experiencing a tremendous amount of problems at the moment with knife crime.
Sense a question coming. I think there's going to be a question, a gentleman in front of you.
I think I'm just going to pass it on. Mine was more of a statement, so I do apologise. Thank you.
Chris Scott, I'm a businessman, but I come from the Cotswolds. But the two things. Firstly, Kate, I thought you're absolutely spot on. When I came back from working abroad to UK, I was horrified how many people who I just considered
Hold the mic a bit closer.
normal middle-class people were in fact fueling this very problem. But what I would like to say to Mac is, how do you see the police reshaping themselves? It's all very well to talk about more frontline resources. The new front line is a lot of the things that you talked about in the widening remit. But the people that you have on the force weren't recruited against those specific, often very complex and new subject areas. And they don't need to be done by uniformed police officers. And often they can be done by much more effectively and efficiently by subcontracting some of that work out to people who really are. So how do you see that changing?
And one more. Gentleman over there.
Can you hear me? Thanks. Sam Lords from Wave Trust. So really interesting, Duwayne, listening to your thoughts about engaging with the community. But I'm thinking of what Katie was saying about kids who, for them, violence is natural. And I'm thinking of the kids who maybe, they're born into a home where there is already violence in that home. Perhaps there's domestic violence in that home from the word go, or there's other violent things. And as a baby and as a 1-year-old and as a 2-year-old, we know there's enough science out there that if you're absorbing that violence in your very early years, then you're going to express that. And that's not all of the kids. Duwayne's right that there's engagement. But I just wonder how we can maybe talk a little bit more about the fact that there is some prevention that can happen here. That does need to involve engaging with people like health visitors, the NHS. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how that might work.
Okay, so are we recruiting the right types of people to fight crime? And really, there's the public health approach. Are we talking enough about it? Duwayne.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think the Met are recruiting. They need to subcontract, but the Met is an organisation who's a law unto themselves, and they want to do things the way that they want it done, and they resist in change. It's quite clear that they resist in change, and anybody that tries to suggest a tiny amount, 3 degrees of change, is called an enemy of the police, and we're seeing that politically. On your questions about a lot of these young people do have traumatic lives, and domestic violence is happening at home. And then what happens is they go to school and other issues take place at school. Now, I believe we should have early intervention at primary school, because if police officers are searching a child at 8 or 9, at 10, we know something's wrong. So at that stage, the school and the local authority alongside the police should be working together to find out what is happening. Now, if this young person is being caught up by older people, asked to deliver a package here or deliver a package there, then it's incumbent on the police to engage with the families to find out how we can get involved and arrest those who are using these young people. Now, I don't agree with what Matt said around putting restrictions on people who are, at the end of the day, innocent. They haven't been through a court system. I really don't agree with that. And one of the reasons for it is police always break their own laws. And we see it around stop and search. When Theresa May's Home Secretary made her statement about reducing stop and search, it was based on what the HMIC had said. It wasn't Theresa May who just said all of a sudden, oh, I'm going to reduce stop and search. It was the figures, the huge amount of unlawful stop and searches that were taking place in the Met and across the country. And that's what she based her policy on. Now, if we can't trust our local police where we live, then it's very, very difficult to help work on those cases where we know children are being exploited and we know the family wants to do something. But if they cannot trust the police to keep them secure, keep them safe, and in some cases they have to be moved because of the threat. If we can't do that, it's very difficult to help and assist those who was mentioned before, those children where violence is normal.
Thanks. Mac, do you want to come back on either the, are we getting recruitment right, and then anything else?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I don't know if we're violently agreeing on the engagement. Yeah, I led engagement for the whole of the Met across the whole of London for about 3 years. You know, I value it. It's probably the hardest job we've ever done, and it's not superficial. So, for example, following the riots that broke out on the 11th of August, the 6th of August 2011, you know, when you were dealing with those issues, it just wasn't the riots. It was 60 years of life experience. You really had to go in and understand the lived-in experience and appreciate it, and empathise to show that you're really listening. That's how you get people on your side, when there's a genuine care and desire to listen and work together. So I get all of that. The point I was making about it, I think there must be more of that dedicated. I think there can be some change in the way we do things. Not everybody needs warranted powers. Not every officer who walks the beat needs to be really clever at computers and doing cyber stuff. We can do all of that. But I also think there's some policy decisions that should be more modern. For example, one of the complaints, and I completely get this from the public, is actually the minute and I was guilty of it as well, so I'm blaming myself, but there's got to be a solution to this. The minute you put a neighbourhood officer into a neighbourhood, as soon as they get known and familiar and liked, we move them on. Or sorry, I keep saying we. The police move them on. The police move them on. Now, that can't be a sustainable issue. There's reasons why that happens. I understand that. But there's got to be a different way of reward and recognition to reward people for staying in those neighbourhoods. Because when I joined 32 odd years ago, officers were in neighbourhoods for a long, long time. In fact, I know officers who've had roads named after them because of the service they've given to that community, and they've long retired now for 20, 30 years, and they're still remembered by those communities. That's the impact I'm talking about.
Just on youth services, I think there needs to be a really sort of honest conversation and assessment of the state of youth services in the UK at the moment. everyone in this room will know that, you know, when the cuts came, that youth services, because they're not statutory, it means that you're able to make those cuts quite easily. And I think the mentality in some ways, you know, youth services are not essential, because if you've got to make choices between a social care budget or youth services, then youth services are a lot easier to cut, because it doesn't come with the same kind of responsibilities. But I think the idea that there's something fluffy about youth services, or perhaps, you know, a basketball session after school actually isn't that important. You know, I think that's an incorrect way of thinking, because for young people, if you're in an environment that's not school, not home, but you have a relationship with older people, which is much more mature, and you're able to speak your mind, I think that's a really powerful connection that's built up. And definitely over the last sort of 8 years, that has broken down. And something else that is concerning is we know that young people that are going into gangs are often maybe just 10 years old. So the idea that youth services start as a teenager, you know, I think there needs to be a bit of a reassessment on that. I think when we're talking about services for young people that are outside of school, we need to go right down to the age of 4. As soon as children are in school, there needs to be a lot more care about what happens to young people in those hours between like 3:30 and 5 o'clock before they're back at home again, because those are really powerful hours in which an adult can do some really valuable work with young people. So it varies a lot from borough to borough as well, and it's not the case that, particularly in London, it's not the case that Conservative boroughs are better funded compared to Labour ones. Conservative boroughs are able to do more with young people. It's across the board, and it's how different boroughs prioritise their money. So we did a similar talk last week at the Labour Party conference, and they were talking about making youth services statutory. And I think that's an interesting idea that they've come up with, and they certainly seem to think there might be some value in that.
Okay, we'll take 3 more. Lady at the back there in the red jacket.
Amanda McIntyre from the Stefano Foundation and a domestic abuse and parenting programme called For Baby's Sake. I cheered to the rafters the day the Evening Standard responded to the Serious Youth Violence Commission with the heading, "We need a trauma-informed public health approach." To get those words on the front page of the Standard was fantastic. So how can we keep the momentum and encourage politicians and others not to shy away from the trauma-informed? And also, how can we encourage everyone to follow the evidence about investing earlier, actually conception to age 2? Because as John Carnahan, who set up the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, said to an audience of 2,500 people in Glasgow last week at an event about adverse childhood experiences, the most important 4 years of a child's life are up to the age of 3.
2 more. Gentleman there, white shirt.
David Pearson, Oxford East Conservatives. Duwayne, you said at the start that 60% of stop and searches are drugs related, of which 99% of those are related to cannabis. And Mac, you also said that increasingly we need to prioritise how we use police resources with a limited budget. So I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on the legalisation of cannabis. I think it would have many, many benefits, freeing up police time. We could regulate it, we could tax it, we could put health warnings on it. And I think it's very clear that there is a clear link between drugs and violent crime. So legalising drugs to me seems like a no-brainer.
There is, of course, an even bigger link between alcohol, which is legal, and violent crime. But anyway, I'm just a chairman. And then we've got one more question. Gentleman there at the front.
Phil Clark, Orpington. I was going to ask exactly the same question about cannabis, having been to a brilliant session here at the conference, and that justified legalising just on health grounds because of elimination of death and psychosis through having proper legal distribution as opposed to through illegal drug gangs. So I'm with you, I'm afraid. You can actually reduce a lot of the driver of crime and actually free up a lot of police time by legalising cannabis. So just get on with it.
Okay. We'll take another one because that was the same question then. Gentleman behind you.
Hello there. I was just asking, in regards to people who are on the autistic spectrum, do you believe in a derogation of rules for arrestees of people on the autism spectrum in order to sort of target the reasons behind their offending, so therefore it doesn't cause reoffending and they have more confidence in their outcome?
Right, there's 3 there. So how do we keep up the momentum on the public health approach? Should we legalise cannabis? And should there be special allowances made, I suppose, in terms of criminal justice for those with autism? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Duwayne.
On the trauma, I'm doing some stuff on trauma, but I can't talk about it right now. But you'll soon see, because I think it's very important. So I'm doing quite a bit on trauma right now, but it's all a bit. But you'll all see it very soon. Legalising cannabis, well, I don't smoke, and I remember the effects on those who used to smoke at lunchtime at school. Just on that, I don't have any other experience or medical experience or training, but just watching the impact of those at school who used to smoke at lunchtime and then go into the lessons after, I wouldn't advocate legalisation of cannabis just on that, because I used to see the difference of those who went for a quick smoke round the back before they came back to lessons after lunch. And on the last point, I think that there's issues around training in terms of the criminal justice system when it comes to those, as you mentioned, autism spectrum. And I do believe that a lot more needs to be done and a lot more understanding needs to take place. And I think it's difficult because children, as you mentioned, are not as prevalent in the criminal justice system as those who don't have that issue. And so it makes it a bit difficult for those who experience. I have a family member that has autism, and it's been a struggle for their parents. And it's because many of the people they come up against don't actually have personal experience. So it's what they've learned from uni or what someone else has told them, and they are finding it quite difficult. So I don't know if they should have special dispensation, but I think that we should be doing more about understanding what's actually happening.
Yep, Kate.
I don't think we should legalise cannabis. I think it's a gateway drug, and I think for many people it becomes a lifestyle that is completely limiting and very much ruins your choices and your chances in life. I think the fact that it is illegal is a deterrent, and I think it should stay that way. And it was nice to get some praise for the Evening Standard. I had no idea where you were going with that one, and I definitely thought I didn't know. But as a paper, we're really, really concerned about this, particularly violent crime in London. But if there's more we can do on the trauma and looking at how young people are affected, particularly between birth and the age of 3, as you said, then that's something that I'd really like to talk to you about, and we'll try and cover as a newspaper. And I'm sorry, sir, I don't have the expertise to be able to answer your question correctly.
So I'm going to make this pretty quick. My answers are very similar to my colleagues here. Everything about cannabis that I've experienced through my work has always been harmful or negative. Having said that, my mind is slightly more open because of the recent learning through examples of health. So I'm not going to rule it all out, but certainly I would personally now have a much more open-minded approach to it. We've talked a lot about children between the age of 0 and 5. I totally agree with that. One of my regrets was seeing the Sure Start program. I don't know if you recall it. For those young years between 0 and 5, especially with the families that we used to engage with all the time, and those services taken away, I thought that was a backward step. So something like that coming in, I would value. And I think any type of mental health condition where people need specialist services, specialist understanding, has got to be a good thing. They just can't go through the normal criminal justice system having the same rules applied, because that's unfair and not right.
Okay. 3 more. I think there's a lady here. Sorry, the lady there. Yeah, exactly.
Susie Webb, Richmond Park. I'd like to refer to the cannabis question. I personally think the use of cannabis for medical purposes, the sanctioned use, is a good idea. But I do worry about cannabis use because, having worked with offenders for many years, I know that I've dealt with second, third, and even now fourth generations of families who have been cannabis and other substance misusers. And they are the parents that bring up these children that have no positive role models. They do get involved in gangs and knives and all sorts of other crime. You're not just saying yes to cannabis for you to smoke it. You're saying you smoke it, but you've got to be compos mentis and competent to bring up this child. These children have to be thought of. And therefore, I would say don't legalise cannabis. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Okay, I think the panel have been unanimous in that nobody supports legalising it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Gentlemen?
Angus Ross, Portsmouth South. When we're talking about the behaviour of young children, the question of education comes up. We say, yes, education is a wonderful thing, but surely one of the answers is to have a lot more of it. What are the children going to do, as you say, between 3 o'clock and 5:30, when there's nothing else to engage them? And I think the schools do have an enormous role to play in that direction. And that would help. But the point I really wanted to make, and the question I wanted to ask was, isn't it time for the rules of engagement of the police to be relaxed a little bit? In the good old days, the policemen knew the villains and they dealt with the villains. You know, maybe they duffed them up. But if the rules of engagement were relaxed a bit, then maybe the general public will be a little bit more respectful of the police, even a little bit frightened of the police. And I think that would be a thoroughly good thing.
And there's one more over here.
Thank you, Kevin O'Neill from CGI. I'm not sure I'd advocate duffing up the public, but interested, Duwayne, in what you said around stop and search. Clearly quite an emotive subject for a lot of people. There's been quite a lot of information that suggests that stop and search doesn't work because it can turn people into criminals that might not have been there beforehand. What would you and the rest of the panel say to that?
All right, that's 3. Duwayne, do you want to pick up on that one?
Okay. There are a number of reports out now. The latest, I think, is from the College of Policing around, I think it was the Met's view that they wanted to increase stop and search. And the report came back that there's no correlation between the reduction in stop and search and increasing crime. Again, my view is that we need stop and search as a deterrent. It has to stay there, regardlessly. But what needs to happen is it needs to be done in a way that's respectful. And as I mentioned earlier before, lawfully. And just to recap on that, Theresa May's vision was based on HMIC's report of nearly, I think it was 240,000 unlawful stop searches. So stop search is a deterrent. Do we need it? Of course we do. We want to send a message to those who are carrying weapons on our streets that it's illegal to carry weapons and we don't want weapons on our streets. We want everyone to live in a safe and secure country. Can we make changes? Yes, we can. Can we improve on how it's done? Yes, we can. Do we want the police to have more powers around stop and search? Today, they are not needed. Our police just need to work a bit more efficiently. What was that second question? No, it was on cannabis again, wasn't it? So my view on cannabis is, as I mentioned before, in terms of duffing up the public. So when I was young, where I grew up, we had our own Bobby. And he used to walk around our estate and he would come and play football and cricket with us in the park. And he would come to our school and fix our BMXs. And whenever we were doing stuff that we shouldn't do, he would always be around. And we preferred that clip on the ear rather than him going to our door and saying, we've just seen your children do A, B, C, D. Now, that was back then. So we didn't mind that. Don't do it again. Don't let me catch you there again, boys. That's not what you should be doing. So that was when I was around 8, 9, 10. That was early 80s. The duffing up that you're mentioning around has changed this time around, and I wouldn't advocate, nor would I be happy if the police decided that that was a course of action to stop people committing crime.
Thank you, Kate.
Just quickly, I've got to go, but I would just say I'm 32, and I grew up in the Lake District, and then I lived in Newcastle, then I lived in Sheffield, and now I live in London. And I've spent quite a lot of time in each of those places, and I can honestly say I've never known who my community police officer is. No idea at all. I can't even think I ever met them or came across them or had any kind of meeting with them. So it's just an observation that I've thought of now, but the fact that I have no idea and have had no interaction with a community police officer. I mean, obviously I was a SWAT, so I wasn't doing anything very naughty, but the idea that I should have known who my community police officer was seems a little bit alien to me.
Matt.
Can I just talk about the point about duffing people up? Interesting. Let's not throw it out. I'm joking. There is a really serious point about this where I think police officers need to be professional, accountable, and legal. There's absolutely no qualms about that whatsoever. But equally, if we have a look at, if there's some research here to be done, if you have a look at, I think police officer confidence has been undermined considerably for trying to do the wrong thing, being accused of either overstepping the line or using the wrong language, and they find themselves hauled under quite a brutal, severe, harsh discipline process, and there's lots of examples of that. And I think instinctively communities do trust the police. I just think that the institutions need to trust the police to just get on with their jobs. And I think that's the best way forward, because they need to use their professional judgment in a lot of these things. They know where the boundaries are, they're acceptable to me and you, but let's not put too much structures around them which inhibits their operation.
Thanks very much. We've been very kindly joined by Paul Scully, MP, who has very, very kindly stepped in after we had a last-minute dropout. So thank you to him for coming. We've had questions ranging from should we legalise cannabis, why is knife crime going up over the last 2 years, what's changed? You've been involved, obviously, with the London political scene for a long time. We thought, what do you make of it all?
Thank you very much.
And what are you going to do to fix it?
Absolutely, everything. Look, thank you very much. Look, there's no way that 5 minutes of me is going to replace an hour of Sean. But nonetheless, you know, this is a guy that's actually, as Duwayne has actually been on the front line, has seen everything that's been going on, speaks to the people, speaks in their language, in their style, and can relate to everything. If I'm sitting there, I'm a 50-year-old white middle-class bloke. If I'm trying to talk to people at an early stage, explaining to them why they shouldn't be joining gangs, why the realities of, from the promise of getting a decent pair of trainers and a couple £100 a week is actually being a mule for if you're a bloke, and possibly being abused sexually if you're a woman or a girl in gangs. The reality of it is pretty damn horrific, but I can't, as a 50-year-old bloke, tell young people that and convince them. It takes people that can actually speak in their language that they respect, they understand, and that's why Duwayne, Sean, and all the people in our party that actually do look like and sound like and relate to those parts of London, those kids, can speak to them. They will then start to hopefully listen. But it's also about them engaging with the charities, the fantastic groups, the St Giles Trust and these sort of organisations, Red Threads, that do amazing work with preventing gangs. Because actually, by the time you have put a child has a knife in his hand, it's too late. So the last round of questions is all about policing, but frankly, it's too late by that point in terms of the long-term process. So we need to engage at a really early stage. However, in terms of stop and search, there have been things that have changed since Theresa May started to curtail the use of stop and search and talk about the curtailing of stop and search. Body-worn cameras is a significant progress, because actually the number of complaints has started to reduce quite significantly. It went up originally, but actually when people realised that police were wearing body-worn cameras, it made the police understand what they were doing and how they were doing and how they were affecting people more, and they were able to play it back to people at a very early stage. Community policing is really important because it's not about duffing people up, but it's about getting trust of younger people. You know, we've always heard about the clip around the ear, these kind of things, rather than duffing up. I think that'll be the phrase, wouldn't it? But if people actually saw the policeman on their street corner, in their area, maybe around their house, their school, and stuff like that, they could build a relationship, some style of relationship. I was on the Victoria Derbyshire show earlier on in the year in Haringey in Tottenham Civic Centre, and I thought this wasn't exactly my good hunting ground. It was going to be a tough gig, and yeah, it was. But actually, the guy that came to my rescue was a former gang member, a community activist. That when we were talking about police resource, and I was getting it in the neck for government cutbacks and these things on a national scale that people have been talking about, when I was actually talking about the reality of Sadiq Khan's choices about his budget and how he's spending on police resources. The fact that actually the police have 110 million quid partly through the mayor, to be fair, partly through the government and partly through the increase in the precept. They're sitting on 110 million quid that they could start to use to recruit more policemen, and every single London MP has been calling for that. But when I was explaining this to Victoria Derbyshire, and I was getting it in the neck, as I say, it was the community activists that have been through all of this that came to my rescue, said, you know what, this isn't all about resource, this isn't all about money. This is about how you use police officers, how you build community trust, how you work with people. And that's the key thing. And that's the opportunity, I think, that Sean will absolutely get this. He does get this. And crime is such a salient point in the many, many issues that we have to tackle over the next 18 months. And I'm really looking forward to working with Sean and Duwayne and others to actually make sure that we get this across to people. So not only do we look at the positive aspirational vision for London, why people come to London in the first place, but while they're here, they must feel safe.
Excellent.
Right, we've got time for one last question. No longer than 30 seconds. David Goodhart, over there.
Okay, I mean,
answers.
Violent crime is obviously a problem for all Londoners, but it's a particular tragedy, as you were just implying, for Black London. And you know, is there some sort of special role for Black politicians, Black community leaders, in responding to it, in helping to create solutions? And second brief point, there's no point being naive about this. I mean, going back to the 70s and the 80s, there was a kind of war between the Met and young Black Londoners. And there is no longer a war, but some of that sort of poison has been transmitted down the generations. And that has to be taken into account when we're talking about this issue. There's still a huge amount of disaffection. It may be less justified than it was in the 1980s, but it is still there. And that has to be tackled.
Okay, very quickly, Mac, do you want to kick off on that one?
Yeah, David, I agree with you. There's an enormous amount of legacy which is just seeping through. Engagement is a tool to be able to do that, but you just don't do it one day a week. You build it up and keep it going, and that's the way to do it. I think that Black community leaders play a real role in this, and there's lots of them there. But also we've got to move beyond that approach. It's getting into the community, past the community leaders, to be able to absorb lots more views and get a lot more relationship going.
Nice brief answer, thank you.
Again, as I mentioned earlier, engagement, and that's what I've been talking about since I've been here today. But I don't see the relevance of Black community leaders when it comes to Black people committing crime. Crime doesn't look at colour. So what we need to do is deal with those who are committing crime, as we will do with anybody, Black, white, Asian, whatever your skin colour. That's not the issue. It's if you're committing crime and you are creating fear where you live, then you need to be dealt with. It's as simple as that, whether it's a prosecution or the local housing association is going to move you, whatever it needs to happen, needs to be done. We shouldn't be concentrating on colour. Colour isn't the issue.
Yeah, I think Dwayne's absolutely right. In terms of colour, I think what we have to remember. I talked a lot about gangs in my bit, and you were referring to gangs. Actually, I think it was the St Giles Trust. I'm on the Offensive Weapons Bill Committee. The guy, the head of the St Giles Trust, was actually talking about the fact that a comparatively small amount of knife crime is actually gang related. It's gangs that start the kernel of the reason why people carry weapons, to feel safe in their area, but it expands way beyond gangs, and we've got to give those kids the sense of responsibility that you do not, one, you don't need to carry a weapon, two, if you do, chances are you're going to be subject to injury or worse by a weapon. But Duwayne's absolutely right that by the time you've got through engagement and you are finding people with knives, then yeah, you do have to come down hard. And there has to be the deterrent, there has to be the punishment, and there has to be an understanding so that the deterrent is absolutely effective, rather than some kid thinking, I'm invincible, I can get away with this. So you're absolutely right.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much to all our panellists and all of you for coming. Do look out for Policy Exchange's future pieces of work and research on livable London issues, from crime and housing, and how we make London a more livable city. And look forward to reporting back in 12 months' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.